and so on to keep track of what the agent is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And this better aligned, in my judgment, this model better aligned with civ-mil on a daily basis than did the Huntington model.
Mm-hmm.
And so I adapted that framework, applied it to the civil military context, and that's what that book is about.
Shifting gears a little bit, we've talked a lot on this podcast about the civil military gap and how there's this divide that's growing maybe between civilians and the military. And we've suggested in a lot of ways that this has negative ramifications for society. You have done a significant amount of empirical research on the civ-mil gap. If someone, a listener of this podcast or anyone, had just heard the term civil military gap for the first time, how would you explain it to them?
Well, I probably would use the phrase 1% and 99%, because that's another way that idea is boiled down to a bumper sticker. That we 1% of the country joins the military. It's actually a little smaller than 1%, and that 1% is pledged to defend the other 99%. And how do the values and attitudes and perspectives of that 1% compare to the 99%? And are there areas where they're in alignment? Are there areas where they're different? Of course, you would expect there to be some difference because it's a volunteer, recruited dimension. And so people who really want certain things are going in that, and most other people are not. So you would expect there to be some difference. But what are those differences? How functional are they? Are any of those differences worrying? That's what the gap question is. And in the mid-90s, this issue, which is a hardy perennial of American civil-military relations theory, I mean, it goes back really to the framers of the Constitution who worried about just such a gap emerging, and were military values consistent with good democratic liberal values. That issue, Huntington wrestled with it in his book. It's a hardy perennial, but it returned with some urgency in the mid-90s in the wake of the Clinton problems in civil-military relations. And Smith Richardson, the foundation, wanted a big study of it done. And they competed it out. And Dick Kohn was one of the people he's a very prominent historian of American civil mil. If you haven't interviewed him, he's got to be next on your list. He's wonderful. But he was toying with doing this project, but he wanted help. And I can still remember I was in London. He called me. I was in one of those little phone booths. I had to call him back or whatever. And, it's very much old school kind of technology, but we were talking and convinced ourselves, let's try to bid on this research project from Smith Richardson. And that's what led to the TIS project on the gap between the military and civilian society. And we did what still is to this day, I think, the largest systematic study comparing military attitudes to elite civilian attitudes to the general public.
Mm-hmm. And that, for our listeners, is the triangle study that's been mentioned before. So what are some of the ways in which you found the military is actually different from the rest of society?
Well, probably the finding that most people remember from that study was the decline in independence, in the political independence, people who identified neither with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in the officer corps, the elite officer corps, that as the years since Vietnam and the all-volunteer force got baked in to the officer corps, increasingly officers were willing to identify with the Republican Party rather than with independents or Democrats. Mm-hmm. And that raised question about whether there was a politicization, a partisan nature identity being formed in the officer corps. And people worried about that in the 90s, and it's still an issue to this day. People are wrestling with the politicization of the military. I don't think that was certainly wasn't our only finding. I mean, we had 1,000 pages of scholarly analysis and many, 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 many other results. But that was one that was fairly prominent at the time.
So we have this 99% that places a high level of confidence and public trust in the military, in the 1%. But at the same time, there is a decreasing willingness to join the military for that 99% to cross over into the 1%. And so the military isn't representative of the whole nation. And in many ways, as you describe it, there's a professional military caste emerging. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, it's a function of the changing technology of war, which reduces the size that's needed, the size of the personnel, how many people need to go into the military to still have a lethal and capable force. That number today in 2019 is a fraction of what it was 20 years ago, and that was a fraction of what it was, in the say World War II, when the U.S. military reached its largest size. You can have a much more lethal and capable and flexible, usable force, and at a much smaller size. Technology compensates for mass or for personnel. But you're recruiting you still have to have some, but you're recruiting a much smaller number. And that makes things like a draft where you would draw in millions and millions of people and draw from all sectors of society. It makes a draft like that unworkable. A draft force would be far less militarily capable, far less useful in defending U.S. national security interests than our current military. So you're going after just a few. Well, now that introduces the opportunity to just get those who want to serve as opposed to those who maybe ought to serve but don't want to.
Right.
And you combine these, and over time you get powerful selection effects. And so your willingness to join this unusual institution is partly a function of your familiarity with it. And if you have friends and loved ones who've served, like your parents, you're familiar with it and you know the good and you can manage the bad. And over time, you'll get that selection effect drawing from smaller and smaller groups.
But is that caste system, that family tradition, something that the framers of our country wanted or envisioned?
No. But they didn't envision a military as sizable as we have today in peacetime. They imagined that we would rely on citizen militias that were primarily housed at the state level, who, when the balloon went up or when the bugle call went out, would rally to arms, and farmers would put down their pitchforks and pick up their rifles and deal with the problem and then go back to being farmers. And that just is not a realistic model for our 21st century challenges. And so what we have today and what we need today is something very, very different from what the framers imagined. But the great achievement of U.S. civil-military relations is that we're able to have something so different that nevertheless has remained more than not subordinate to civilian authority and living under the democratic principles that our framers set out. And so I think we, the United States, are a civil-military relations success story, even though I spend most of my time looking at the places, at the warts. Even though I focus on the warts, it's worth recognizing that the overall picture is beautiful and something to be proud of.
We'll be back after this break.
Chicago, the Windy City, the city of broad shoulders, the second city, is complicated.
Known for its legacies of segregation and political corruption, Chicago has a lot to grapple with.
On Chicagoland, we bring you conversations with activists, journalists, politicians, and others who are working to address these issues.
You can find Chicagoland wherever you listen to podcasts.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts,
this is Chicagoland.
So in some of your previous work and remarks, you've described how the American public, despite being across the board pretty skeptical of institutions and of government, has this high level of confidence in the military that's lasted for a while. We were wondering if that high level of confidence is something that can be taken for granted in American society, or if there are factors in the future maybe that would shake that confidence.
Yeah, this is an important question. So when I was divvying up who was going to do what on the TIS gap study 20 years ago, the two topics that I kept for myself, me and co-authors, one was how civilians in the military differed on the use of force and whether that mattered. And I did a whole series of projects with Chris Jelpy on that. And the other one was how public attitudes and public high confidence in the military, whether that mattered and whether that familiar poll finding, which was familiar even in the late 90s, that the military was held in high esteem when other political institutions were not, or most others were not. Whether that, what did that mean and how durable was it? That was the other project I kept for myself, and I did that with Paul Gronke. So in that, Paul and I analyzed our data and came to the conclusion that it was, I think the title of our chapter was Brittle or Uncertain Confidence. I can't remember the title, but the concept was that, yes, it's high, but that confidence is brittle and could be shaken. And we identified different ways in which we thought it was going to go down over the next 20 years. So how does that prediction look 20 years out? Wrong. The public support for the confidence in the military remains very high, much higher than I would have predicted based on the things that I was seeing in the late 90s. Now, part of that is, of course, 9/11. That's part of the story, but it's not all of the story. And so the research project I'm doing right now with Jim Golby, who's one of the top scholars or experts on civ-mil of the younger generation, he and I are, right now, in fact, because I'm talking to you, I'm not working on our data right now, trying to understand public confidence in the military. Why is it high? What are the determinants of it? What does it matter? Does it matter that the public has high confidence, or is it superficial? And we did a big survey through NORC, and we got a lot of data. In fact, just yesterday we were talking, we said we have way too much data. I don't know how we're going to make sense of it and get it into, publishable form. But the survey was designed to really tap into understanding why does the public have confidence in the military. And we have survey experiments that manipulate the information respondents have and then see what that does to public confidence numbers. And it's a fascinating question. I think it's one of the most interesting questions in American civ-mil scholarship today, and it's what I'm working on.
You've noted in the past that you find it to be somewhat analogous maybe to the high level of confidence that the public used to place in the Supreme Court.
Yes, this might be the area where I'm wrong. So one of the things I said in the 90s, I still say it today. Mm-hmm. If you asked me to speak on the subject today, I'd still say it today, but I don't have as much confidence in it as I did 20 years ago. I worried that if the military developed a partisan caste, then confidence in the military would drop. And to me, the Supreme Court was a good illustration of that, because there had been high confidence in the Supreme Court, just like the military. And then over 2 decades, the Supreme Court became increasingly perceived as a partisan institution. I think there's Republican judges and Democratic judges. For a while there, we had 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 1 confused individual. And that created a perception of the Supreme Court more like Congress, which is looked on as highly partisan. And so I said, if the military develops this caste, then it would be bad for public confidence in the military. So that's what I said then. Jim Golby, in his dissertation and other work, challenged part of my argument, and I realized that I was either going to have to fight him the rest of my life or co-author with him. And so I co-authored with him, and he convinced me that I missed, in some of my earlier work, the degree to which partisanship was shaping generic attitudes towards the military, that there was a partisan gap in public confidence, that the Republican numbers were really, really high in the 90s, Democrat numbers much lower. And so it would net out to an average in the supermajority, but that was